The Switch 2 was the most successful console launch in Nintendo's history. And in the run-up, the stock hit an all-time high of over 14,500 Japanese yen and then fell almost 50%. And when I saw this, I just wondered, how can this be? How can a business with a multi-decade track record, an absolute fortress of a balance sheet with over 14 billion in US dollar denominated cash sitting idle, and a library of IP that can only really be rivaled by Disney in terms of cultural significance? So I had to dive into it and learn for myself, what is Nintendo as a business? Is it a good business? How does it compete in the marketplace? And ultimately, is it over or undervalued by the market right now after such a big sell-off? My name's Christian. I'm a CPA and senior financial analyst. And what I want to do in this video is walk you through my research on Nintendo to understand the value proposition and the business model, the geography of their sales, who their customer is, and the demographics of users, because the person who buys a Nintendo console is not the same person who plays on it, as well as each segment of revenue that Nintendo has and really understanding how they make money. And then finally looking at several business quality metrics, such as the return on invested capital and their free cash flow conversion profiles, and putting it all together to just form a really strong foundation that we can take to later videos where we look at the financial statements, the moat, and then any risks and opportunities that the business has, management, and a final valuation at the end. So let's just jump in. So the first thing you have to understand about Nintendo, which completely separates it from a lot of other gaming businesses, is that this is a closed ecosystem built on fun. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. Nintendo has built this incredible library of IP, which they distribute access to through their consoles. So this is a hardware lock. When they sell the consoles, those consoles have lower margins, but if you want to play those games, you have to buy the console. That is your entry point to your favorite games. The second key point of their business model is the multi-generational aspect of nostalgia. Nintendo is actually a business that goes back over 100 years, but the modern business that we think of it today still has 4 to 5 generations of players. And it is not just a game to them. It is something that they care deeply about and is almost embedded in their personality. It is part of them. As a personal example, I played God knows how many hours of Pokemon when I was a kid. And even though I don't play it anymore and I'm not active in the community or anything like that, I still have a very deep sweet spot in my heart for that game and for the characters. So these customers are lifelong fans and they pass that experience to their children without needing to be prompted to do so. For example, I don't have children. One day I probably will, and I want to play Pokemon with my kid. I want to be able to experience that with them and show them the cool world of Pokemon. That is a superpower for a business to have. It is basically guaranteed or much cheaper customer acquisition than anybody else has to do. And then the third pillar of Nintendo's business model is that the brand of Nintendo conveys both fun and safety. Parents want to give their kids gaming experiences that are both of those things. And Nintendo as a brand is a trusted quality signal that parents know about and feel comfortable allowing their kids to play. We'll get into this way more, but just on a fundamental basis, this guy, I think his name's Kratos, I might be wrong, he's from God of War, versus this guy. You don't have to be an expert to understand which of these a parent is going to want to allow their child to play with. And the fact that Mario is so well known and so culturally embedded, like we've talked about, simply adds on to the games as an attractive entry point for a parent to start their child's gaming experience with. So I think that brings us to a very interesting question, which maybe pause the video and have a think about. Who is Nintendo's customer? Is it the person who wants to play the game, or is it the person purchasing the console for the person who wants to play the game? In most businesses, the person who makes the purchase decision and the person who consumes the product is the same person. And for for Nintendo, that is not always the case. So fundamentally, the primary relationship for Nintendo is that they have the buyer who is the parent, and that person wants safety, quality, and value for what they're paying for. Ultimately, you're paying for a toy for your kid, so you don't want to spend a ton of money on something necessarily for your kid. And then on the other side, you have the child, who is the person who wants to play the game. They want to play the same games that their friends are playing, etc., etc. And this buyer-user split has a couple implications. The product has to satisfy two different audiences. So it has to pass the quality check from the parents, and it has to be fun enough that kids can get excited about it. They want to ask for it as a birthday present or a Christmas gift, bring it to school and show the other kids it and talk about it that way. And I think what's worth dwelling on is that over decades, even years, this is a much harder line to walk than you might think. If we think about Roblox, which I didn't really even know about until I started researching this, but is this massive game that kids all over the world are playing, they're really struggling right now with a deep parental skepticism because of all these stories about really terrible things happening to children that is on this platform. Nintendo has that trust aspect, which helps, but you also need to uphold that with your actions and your ability to deliver year over year in order to keep that core audience. And Nintendo has been able to do that. They have that track record. The second is what I would call the joyful child premium. This is the idea that once the child has the console, it becomes a lot easier for a parent to justify paying $70 for a game that makes your kid really happy than it is maybe to justify buying a game for yourself as an adult. I don't game very often, but when I do, I'm pretty stingy about it. I don't always feel like it's worth it, and I want to make sure I get like a game on sale and stuff like that. Maybe I'm just cheap, I don't know. And then the other aspect of this, having this child audience, is that it also clusters purchases around holidays and birthdays and things like that. And that actually provides some pricing power because you don't have to discount as much. This is a birthday gift. It's a special purchase. So parents aren't looking for a discount on the product. And then the third we've talked about a little bit, but I think is worth highlighting again, which is the generational compounding that Nintendo has with its IP. Every child that plays a Nintendo game today and falls in love with it is tomorrow's parent who wants to show their kid that thing. And so the success in one generation really lowers that customer acquisition cost in the next. Success for Nintendo today is actually, I think, an underappreciated indicator of its success in the future because of this special flywheel of parents and children experiencing the games together. Now, beyond the children, there actually is a second cohort of buyers and users that Nintendo caters to. So in 2021, Nintendo shared this age distribution data for active Nintendo accounts within the year. And what's really interesting, I think, is that you have all these players in the childhood demographic, and then this long tail of users over the age of 20 to 25, which is a much more diversified user base than I would expect. However, the caveat is that these are Nintendo accounts. They're not Nintendo players. How many of this group is really just parents making accounts for their children that are under 15, under 10, who are actually using the consoles and playing those games? My personal opinion on this is that it's probably a large percentage of it. Adults are busy and don't have as much time to game. And if you're just buying a console for your kid and you want to get them up and running, a 9-year-old doesn't have the patience to set up an account. So you just do it for them. You put in your own email. That way you're also in control, and then they're playing with it. And this is completely anecdotal, but as part of the research, I ended up having conversations with people who work in the gaming industry, as well as people I know that have kids. And the general gist of it is that Nintendo is very popular with kids still. They haven't lost a generation or anything like that. And you can even just say from the Pokemon card trend that is so big right now, that kids are obviously still interested in Nintendo. So I think if you were to redraw this chart, you'd probably take a decent chunk out of it and move it into here. So maybe look like that, or something. Regardless, I think that either way, they actually have a more distributed cohort than I would have originally thought. And that has pros and cons, right? On one side, that is another cohort expectation that you have to balance. So you're not just making games that parents think look safe and fun and ones that kids want to play, but also games that appeal to older players' sense of nostalgia while still being fun and challenging enough for that age group, right? I remember during COVID, I bought a Pokemon game for the first time in probably a decade. I think it was Pokemon Sword and Shield. And I just remember being like, oh my God, this is awful. This is just a game for children where I just press A over and over again and the lights flash. I've definitely never bought another Pokemon game after that. And that is a con for Nintendo of this demographic group. Whereas at the same time, I think it provides a little bit of safety in terms of if they have a generation of kids that aren't interested in Nintendo games, they have adult players who love the franchises and can smooth out that sales gap that they might lose. Okay, so that brings us to the gaming market and the competition. Where does Nintendo make its money, and how does this compare to the industry as a whole? So first of all, Nintendo generates no more than 40% of their overall revenues from any single continent. It is truly a global business with a large proportion of revenues coming from Japan, Europe, and even the rest of the world, which is actually quite small. That means that a lot of the macro discussion that you might talk about in terms of tariffs, supply chain disruptions, Nintendo has a little bit of a hedge here. With tariffs specifically, obviously having 40% of your revenue come from America, it's not a good thing when tariffs are introduced. However, it's not a catastrophe either. They have some hedging in their geography to protect against an outright failure because prices get too high or margins collapse. The other thing I think that might go unappreciated in an analysis is that currency fluctuations are a relevant factor that you should consider. If you think about it, Nintendo is making most of their money in US dollars and then converting that into Japanese yen. And when we look at some of the financial metrics later on, that's going to have an impact because they're recording foreign exchange gains and losses on the income statement that don't necessarily flow to the cash flow of the business. And then third, what I think is super interesting and worth a whole discussion on its own is that the Switch 2 launch was incredibly successful in the rest of the world. It was successful in America, it was successful in Japan, and it was successful in Europe. But in the rest of the world, year over year, Switch sales was almost 300%. That is a huge increase in the install base of consoles, which should scale to higher software sales of their games in the future. Okay, so this chart here is the same data that we were just looking at in a pie chart format. And then this over here is from Newzoo, and this is the global gaming revenues market. So what we can see here is that Nintendo is definitely over-indexed on North America compared to the overall market, as well as Japan and Europe. And that makes sense given the history of Nintendo. So what is the opportunity here? This is the global revenue of the gaming industry from a different perspective where we're just looking at device. So consoles are about 24%, PC is about 21%, and then mobile makes up the bulk of the global gaming market to date. And that's a $200 billion market that Nintendo is only 6% of if you take their total revenue numbers. So for such an iconic business and such a big player in the industry, they're actually very materially underpenetrated in the market as a whole because they've stuck to their console gaming as the core part of the business. They have some apps on the App Store, maybe some of you play them, but it's never really been a platform that Nintendo takes seriously. And then PC is essentially non-existent. Again, if you want to play their games, you have to go through the consoles, and that is part of their strategy. There are 4.5 billion gamers in the world, apparently, according to Newzoo, and Nintendo has 130 annual players. So again, that's a lot of gamers that they could expand into, but if they wanted to do that, they probably would have to change their business and pivot to a more mobile approach, because a lot of these gamers are in countries where mobile gaming is the dominant gaming platform, not consoles like in North America and Europe for the most part. So this leads me me to, I think, a very interesting conundrum that Nintendo faces, which is a little bit of a trap. So of those gaming platforms, PC, this is how much it's growing by players every year, 3.1%. Mobile, 4.5%. And console is the slowest growing. So the console market, which has been around now for decades, is not fast growing anymore. It's largely saturated, and it's pretty much considered mature and slow growth. So what that means is that by the end of the decade, consoles are going to be the smallest component of the gaming industry as a whole. However, as we've talked about, Nintendo is dependent on their console hardware software ecosystem as their strategy. The reason for this is that, again, if you want to play Nintendo games, you got to buy the console and then they distribute the games to you through that device. And what that means is that there's no intermediary, obviously, unless you buy a physical game at a GameStop or something. But it essentially is a mechanism for protecting their margins. You already have the device, you want to play the game, you pay $60, $70, $80 for that game. You don't have another option. And if they wanted to go into PC, for example, and they wanted distribution through Steam, they'd have to pay a commission to Steam for the distribution. So having their own integrated hardware protects that margin and allows them to capture all of it. If consoles aren't growing anymore, how is the business going to grow? They can't expand materially onto other platforms without disrupting that core business model. That is the narrow channel that Nintendo has to walk in the future in order to continue growth as a business. So how could they grow? How could they grow outside of this trap? What we're talking about when we say grow is growing the free cash flows of the business. And from my perspective, they have probably 4 options for this. Either they can take their IP and they can monetize that into new categories. They can try to be a Disney Light type of company. They released the Mario movie in 2023 to great success. They've opened up several theme parks around the world like Disney, although that's a partnership with Universal. And they're really starting to build a cadence for movies every single year and starting to sell more and more merchandise in association with those movies. So that's one opportunity. The second is increasing ARPU, average revenue per user. So getting every gamer to spend more money in the Nintendo ecosystem. You might see that happening through their third-party eShop and Nintendo Switch Online services. NSO, Nintendo Switch Online, is their subscription that allows you to play online, allows you to access a catalog of old classic games, etc., as well as this eShop, which they're growing, where you can access and download third-party games that aren't made by Nintendo, some of the core ones being Minecraft, Hogwarts, etc. This is also a mechanism for improved margins because digital sales have a better profit margin than physical sales. You don't have the chip that the game is on or the packaging that it comes in or the distribution costs that come from shipping it to retail locations who you then have to provide a commission to for selling the game. It's a much better sale to have in digital format than physically. So their eShop allows them to improve that way. And then finally, they can expand into new demographics. For example, recently they just expanded into Singapore, and this is not like a sales office. This is a headquarters for Southeast Asia, and they're talking about doing the same thing in Thailand as well, actually, which shows the seriousness that they're taking this. However, this is an area of the world that kind of has lower GDP per capita, as well as sort of skipped the console stage of gaming in the population, and they are largely conditioned to use mobile devices for gaming purposes. So it's not clear how successful this is going to be, but it's an option for them and they're taking it seriously. Now, one thing I noticed when I was going through all of Nintendo's investor material is that all these things they're talking about in terms of the movies, their mobile apps, their merchandise, their theme parks and museums and that type of thing, these are all peripheral to the gaming console that they envision at the center of the house around the TV. It's a way to connect with more people and bring them to the gaming console rather than standalone businesses. So the way I would like to think of Nintendo, I think, is that they are a Disney Light business. They have this core IP at the center, and then they build all these businesses around that IP and monetize the heck out of it. I think that would be how they have this huge growth as a business. I don't think they see it that way. In the past, they've been quite cagey about monetizing their IP, which we'll see more of later. I don't know if they have an appetite for doing that. So that might be a red flag, that might be a green flag because you see them as protecting the IP and not diluting it. That's your call to make, I think, as an analyst and as an investor potentially, but I think it is worth flagging. So, okay, we know all this about Nintendo. Who is the competition for them? Who is the threat to their business? For me, I think what's really interesting about Nintendo and what's I think exciting about them is that I don't think they really have any competition when it comes to consoles. Obviously, you can compare them to Sony and Microsoft, but the reality is that these businesses and their consoles target completely different audiences and don't really compete directly with Nintendo. I think that's not even a common question. It's just, does my kid want to play Nintendo games, or are they older and they want to play like Call of Duty and that type of thing? So it's just not the same customer that those platforms are competing for, in my opinion. The real competitive threat, I think, are these new games. And new, I say in quotation marks, but I'm talking about mobile gaming, things like Roblox, Minecraft. Ultimately, if kids spend their time doing that instead of playing Nintendo games, you don't get that emotional attachment, you don't get that nostalgia when they're older, and the business flywheel starts to break down. So just to highlight what I think people would consider to be a big threat right now is Roblox, because it's growing so fast. It's a new idea. I don't think that user-generated gaming has really ever been a thing before. And it's like a platform, I think, closer to YouTube than traditional consoles. I think I need to do a full deep dive series on Roblox to fully understand it. But looking into some of the statistics, I thought it was absolutely fascinating that 30% of their player base is between 10 and 15 years old, and they don't report users under 10. But I think that is probably their main user base, which, I don't know, it's crazy to me that adults let their kids go online when they're like 7 years old and play these games, but that these kids are spending 2.5 hours a day on this game and they're accessing it from mobile. You might say, oh, they're not competing with those kids because they're not spending the console time, but if kids are being trained to game on a mobile device, it's a much heavier lift to get them potentially onto a console and gaming with that. So that is something I think as an analyst you have to be honest about, and something that we need to pay attention to going forward. But it's hard to do that without actually understanding how Nintendo makes money. We've gone through the business model, we've looked at the geographies and some of the growth opportunities, but what we actually need to do is understand how they make money. So the next part of the video, we're going to go through revenue, and Nintendo has 4 revenue streams which are all integrated around the IP and the gaming, but I think is helpful to break them out. So the first is the console hardware, and this, depending on where you are in the console cycle, represents about 40 to 60% of the revenue. It's going to be higher in years where the console launches, which makes sense, and then lower in years where there is no console launch. The purpose of the console is not really a margin driver. It's not where Nintendo makes the bulk of its money. The purpose is really to establish an install base for the software monetization and the sale of the game. That being said, Nintendo is unique as a console manufacturer because they actually demand that they make a margin on the console as well. Xbox has said famously in the past that they make no money and have never made any money on their consoles. Nintendo is not like that. Nintendo likes to make sure that they are making money on basically every sale within the business. They don't have loss leaders, so to speak. And this is cultural and really goes back to the roots of Nintendo as a modern business. It is something that I wouldn't expect to change, and that has implications actually for the current environment where component prices are going up a lot. There's tariffs that are impacting margins, and we're going to want to keep that in mind going forward in this analysis. The second revenue stream is their first-party software, games that Nintendo actually makes themselves. This is Mario, Legend of Zelda, Kirby, Metroid, Fox, and I would consider Pokemon in this, even though Nintendo has a 32% stake in the Pokemon company and doesn't develop it. It's made by Game Freak. It's in a gray zone, but I would consider it a first-party game because you can only access it on Nintendo consoles. So again, the mix of this revenue stream is going to vary depending on where you are in the console cycle, but it's going to be about 25 to 50% of revenue in any given year. And this is really the engine of Nintendo. As we've already gone over, people buy Nintendo consoles to play these games specifically. And these titles have probably around an 80% or higher gross margin attached to them. So that is where Nintendo makes most of its money. One thing to point out here is that the digital mix that we've talked about in terms of selling at a physical location or just digitally through the eShop, they have been slow at this compared to their competitors. Sony, for example, has a much higher digital mix than Nintendo. They have some catch up to do there, but that is also an opportunity for them in order to improve that 80% margin even more. The third revenue stream is their third-party software and Nintendo Switch Online. These are technically different, but in how they report their financials, I'm unable to estimate splitting these out. So I've grouped them as one. You could call it miscellaneous if you wanted to, but these are the primary things in here. And this is quite small. This is 8 to 10% of their revenue. It's not that much, but it is growing. Nintendo Switch Online is pretty interesting. We're going to jump into that a lot more in just a second. But fundamentally, it's a subscription. It is recurring and predictable. And these types of revenue streams typically have low churn because they are not super expensive and they charge you automatically. And that is why SaaS is such a great business model. And then the final revenue stream that we have to talk about is their licensing of their IP. This is the theme parks and film and merchandise, etc. And what I think is truly surprising and fascinating about Nintendo is that this is by far their smallest line of revenue. It's only 3 to 5% of revenue. With an IP library that deep and that culturally embedded and beloved, I really would have thought going into this analysis that it was way higher and that they were a Disney Light type of business, which they are definitely not. So to talk a little bit more about Nintendo Switch Online, which I think is worth understanding, really they have two NSO offerings. They have their baseline, which is about $20 US per year, and then they have their sort of expanded option, which is $50 per year. So this expanded option, rather than just giving you some of the online capabilities like online gaming, voice chat, etc., you get access to these classic games that you can play on your Switch, as well as expansion packs and upgrade packs for some of the Switch 1 games that have been ported to the Switch 2. So I think what's important here is that only 20% of Nintendo's users are on this subscription. This is compared to 38% for Sony, which is on the sort of premium subscription. So probably some growth there, but the demographics of the users being younger for Nintendo mean that they're probably inherently a little less interested in online gameplay, competitive gameplay, and maybe they're never going to be able to get to that 38% mix, but probably they can grow it. The second is that the difference between tier 2 and tier 1 is bigger than going from 0 to tier 1, right? $20 a year for the base level and then $50 a year for tier 2. So this is really interesting, I think, because their older demographic group has obviously more money as adults and are locked in through nostalgia. If Nintendo can continue to add value to this and try to upgrade users from there to there, which wouldn't move this percentage, right? They would still have 27% on the NSO subscription, but it's a more valuable subscription. And that could pretty meaningfully affect the margin. If they were able to do it to everybody, it would more than double it, right? And as a subscription, it is basically 100% margin. There's no incremental cost to upselling somebody. Okay, on third-party software, what's interesting, I think, with the Switch 2 is that it's a lot more powerful than the Switch 1. And I think it's really the first time that their console is going to be capable of playing fan-favorite games like Cyberpunk and Elden Ring and some of these bigger open-world games that are more demanding on the console. The Switch 1 did build this meaningful third-party marketplace, which directly integrates to the Switch 2, and the Switch 2 gets to have that way earlier in its life cycle, but the Switch 2 can also play these games so much better. So I think the Switch 2 becomes a much more direct competitor to some of the other handheld gaming devices that are on the market. There's an Xbox One, I think, developed by Asus, if I'm not wrong about that. People can genuinely look at both of those and say, I can play my favorite third-party games on both, but then with the Switch 2, I also get Mario and Zelda, etc. So there's a really big value add there. And then at the same time, they still have their indie title favorites, Stardew Valley, Silksong, Hades, etc., which just adds a little bit more value again to the Switch 2. And those sales commissions that Nintendo gets through its eShop are basically pure margin. So it's kind of like the inverse of what we talked about, how they would have to give up margin to Steam if they wanted to go on the PC. By building out the eShop and having more offerings there and getting more sales through that, they get more margin, and it's pure margin, 100%, because there's no cost. Okay, so after all this, you're probably thinking Nintendo looks like a pretty incredible business, and maybe you've rushed out and looked at a PE ratio or something like that. But what you have to understand before making any sort of valuation decision on Nintendo is the console cycle. The console cycle is everything for understanding Nintendo, and any metric you look at is going to be heavily skewed depending on where you are in that cycle. So in launch years, their operating margins and their earnings are going to look low, while as in peak years, their operating margins and earnings are going to look high because of the way the mix shifts from the low margin console to the high margin games. Doesn't mean that the underlying business has changed at all, but your PE ratio, for example, is going to look wildly different if you're in the middle of the cycle and earnings are super high. The business might look undervalued, whereas if you're in a launch year, earnings are going to be suppressed because they're transitioning, and the PE ratio might look really good. You have to keep that in mind because the market has definitely priced in the console cycle. It knows what's going on, and you're going to be fooled if you just rely on a metric like that. Free cash flow similarly is going to be weak in years surrounding the launch as they invest into R&D and manufacturing and building up an inventory that they can send out into the world and sell that console through. Whereas in the mid-cycle years, cash flow is going to be super strong. It's going to be very high as they sell all these games. And then finally, in the early years of a console cycle, like we are now, typically you would see a lower software attach rate because there's just a smaller library of games available for gamers to buy. That being said, the Switch 2 is actually unique for this for Nintendo because it has the third-party eShop that we talked about, as well as all Switch 1 games basically port to the Switch 2. So the Switch 2 gets off to this really strong start where some of the most beloved Switch 1 games can just be carried over essentially, either that you already own or that are on the eShop that you still want to play, but you've bought a Switch 2 now. Before, maybe you weren't able to go back and play it, but now you can get the Switch 2 and you could buy Breath of the Wild and you could play that. So that is actually pretty powerful and smooths out the cyclicality of the business, but not completely. So when we chart the numbers, I think you can really clearly see the console cycle. Gray here is revenues, red is income, and then the black line here is their operating margins. And I don't even know if I have to explain it. You can see how revenues and earnings go up in the interim years, and then they come down as the business prepares for the next cycle, and then they explode up as they sell all their new consoles. However, their earnings stay suppressed because it's very much a hardware mix. Some other key things to talk about that are different between the Switch 2 and the Switch 1 at the beginning of the cycle is that the Switch 2 is a much higher cost than the Switch 1. The Switch 1, when it was released, was $299 US, and the Switch 2 is $449 currently. I think it was actually $400 when it launched, but they've raised it, which we'll get into. But the question that the analyst has to figure out is this massive jump and the success of the Switch 2 launch. Is that due to pent-up demand for the Switch 2 console because the Switch 1 was such a long life cycle? And really what happened is that the console sales were just pulled forward and they're going to just drop off really low in the future? Or if the Switch 1 was able to just grow year over year, are we going to see the Switch 2 have this similar growth and it's just totally on another level than the Switch 1? And then finally, Nintendo is also starting from a much higher digital mix of their sales than they were in Switch 1. The early part of the cycle might have a little bit higher earnings because of that digital mix. Okay, so with all this in mind, can we make a decision here on whether or not Nintendo is a good business? It's been around for a long time. We understand the console cycle, we understand how it makes money, and we understand its value proposition, but is it a good business? We can definitely get a strong sense of that by looking at the return on invested capital, the free cash flow profile of the business, as well as the margin structure. So just before we jump into that, I'm a CPA, so we have to touch on the boring accounting stuff before we move on. But it is important because Nintendo reports its financials in JGAAP, or Japanese Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. And these are different than US GAAP or IFRS that a lot of the businesses you might be familiar with report in. It's mostly the same, but I think the main thing to call out is just how they treat R&D. Under IFRS, depending on if the expense meets certain criteria, you can capitalize that R&D expense and then amortize it over the life of the product. But with JGAAP, Nintendo basically expenses all their R&D immediately in the year that it's incurred. So this is generally a more conservative way to report your earnings, and it's going to make their operating income look lower than it might look to an American counterpart. And we'll actually keep that in mind when we're comparing Nintendo to other players in the industry and try to compare them to Japanese businesses because of that. And then the other thing to call out is not a JGAAP specific measure, but that Pokemon is not entirely owned by Nintendo. It's only 30% owned. And that means that they need to report the ownership of that business under what's called equity-based accounting. What that means is that the investment is held at cost, at the original amount that they spent to buy ownership in the Pokemon company, and then it's adjusted for the earnings of the Pokemon company. So those get fed into the valuation on the balance sheet, but they don't flow through Nintendo's income statement as operating income. It will come in on a lower line as investment income, which matters if you're looking at operating margins of the business because they'll appear underinflated, even though Nintendo has a probably larger role in Pokemon than their pure ownership percentage would suggest. Likewise, their free cash flow doesn't include anything from Pokemon unless the Pokemon company pays them a dividend, which I wasn't able to figure out how often that happens or if it happens at all, and they don't report that. And then finally, if you're looking at just Nintendo's assets, because it's on the balance sheet as cost plus earnings, it probably doesn't represent the fair market value of Pokemon, which is the highest grossing franchise of all time and is definitely worth a lot more than whatever Nintendo paid in the 90s for it, plus all the money it's earned since. So that is important to just keep in mind as we go through the rest of this. Okay, number one question we have to ask when we're trying to figure out if Nintendo is a good business. Is Nintendo creating value? And we can assess that through what's called the return on invested capital. So the return on invested capital is basically for every dollar or yen that Nintendo spends, how much money they produce in return. And then we compare that to the cost of their capital. And if it's more, they're in a profit and they're creating value. So the cost of Nintendo's capital, you can approach it in a couple different ways, but fundamentally they have no debt. So it's just the cost of equity. Now, calculating cost of equity can be controversial. It's a little wishy-washy that you could say, but really Nintendo's cost of capital is probably quite low. It's maybe 6 to 10% estimated. What we know is that Nintendo's achieved at least 20% return on invested capital since the Switch 1 was launched. So no matter what way you cut it, however you want to calculate their cost of capital, Nintendo's return on invested capital is definitely a lot higher than that. So we can say pretty emphatically from this that Nintendo is creating value. And if we want to take a little bit of a closer look here, we can again see the console cycle in Nintendo's return on invested capital as it compresses during that early stage and then rises up into these really high numbers. To be honest, 40% return on invested capital is massive. That's like for every dollar they invest, they're making 40 cents. You can imagine how that compounds and then drops off again in the interim years. One thing I really think is great and worth calling out is the difference in the return on invested capital with the Switch 2 cycle versus the first 2 years of the Switch 1 cycle. There wasn't the same drop in return on invested capital because Nintendo's done a great job of digitalizing sales, growing the NSO subscriptions, IP licensing revenue, etc., which simply means they're selling more of these high margin products and therefore don't see that compression in the return on capital that they used to see. That's important and tells you that Nintendo is becoming a better business over time. So the return on invested capital looks great, but we kind of do have to compare it to peers in the industry to actually understand if Nintendo is meeting expectations or outperforming expectations. The issue, like we've discussed, is that Nintendo doesn't really compete directly with Sony and Xbox, and even if they did, it wouldn't really be that easy to compare them because Sony and Microsoft are very different businesses than pure gaming businesses. They have cloud computing in Microsoft's case, Sony has their TV businesses and financial services, and they're both really big conglomerates. It's not easy to parse out what their gaming return on capital is. So what we'll try to do instead is we'll try to triangulate it by comparing it to some other businesses that might be similar. Now, one business I thought would be interesting to look at here is Apple. So Nintendo's in red and Apple's in gray here, and I thought this is interesting because Nintendo is a hardware and software ecosystem, and Apple is a hardware and software ecosystem. So theoretically, even though what they provide is very different, there might be some similarities that we can use to triangulate Nintendo's performance in return on invested capital. And actually what we see is that it's pretty similar. You can see Apple has improved a lot in the last few years, and that is them selling more of their services with the Apple subscriptions and stuff like that. But really, Nintendo is matching Apple for the most part in terms of return on invested capital, with again the exception of the Switch launch year, which we expect. And then we don't want to just rely on Apple because it's such a different business, but what we can do is compare it to some other gaming industry peers that are pure gaming businesses like EA, which should give us some perspective between these two. So Nintendo's in red, EA's gray, and Capcom is black here. And first of all, honestly, what I find interesting is just how much EA has dropped off in the last few years, and then also how much Capcom has improved. Those are both probably worth their own deep dives. But fundamentally, I think what we can take away from this is that Nintendo is a strong performer against both of them, especially in its mid-cycle years. It's either better than both of them or it's just tit for tat. And really, I think between these, we can triangulate that Nintendo is a strong business and is creating value. Now, the follow-up question we have to ask from that is, if they're creating value, are they capturing that value in cash? Some businesses can create value, but then a lot of that cash gets tied up in working capital or other operational costs that suck the cash out of the business. Now, each of Nintendo's segments are going to have different cash flow profiles in terms of how that net income is converted into free cash flow. Hardware is probably less than 10%, whereas the games and the IP licensing are going to range between 70 and 95%, depending on what we're talking about. So the Nintendo Switch Online, for example, probably actually has even higher than 95. It's probably over 100% because they collect that cash up front. But most of the business outside the console is a pretty healthy amount. And again, if we look at the free cash flow margin, we see the same sort of shape over the console cycle. That's why it's so important to keep it in mind. And then the only other thing I'll call out here as we're looking at the cycle from all these different perspectives is fiscal 21. Obviously, this was during the pandemic. And what likely happened is that there was a pull forward in demand. People who were going to buy Nintendo products in future years because they were stuck inside, maybe bought a console or bought some extra games because they had nothing else to do. It's hard to parse out how much of this is what you would call a pull forward versus net new. But I think what we can tell is because the free cash flow profile went up, most of these sales were in software and not in consoles, which again, in a later video when we do the valuation of Nintendo, we'll actually keep that in mind in terms of normalizing the pandemic out of it, because how we model consoles is going to be very different than how we model the software in that year. Okay, that was a lot. If you're still here, thank you for watching. I really hope it was valuable and you learned a lot about Nintendo as a business. If you like that, you probably would like this video over here. In it, I take Warren Buffett's 4 rules for investing and apply them to NVIDIA and see if it passes. And otherwise, if you liked the video, like it, and thank you for watching.